In the 1850s, there were serious economic, social, and political differences between northern and southern states. One serious issue during the 1800s involved a tariff, or tax, on manufactured goods such as cloth, tools, and machines. In the United States, most of the factories were located in the north. At that time, many European companies manufactured goods at a lower cost than American companies. So to keep American factories economically strong, northern senators and congressmen sought to put a high tariff on European manufactured products entering the United States. This tariff would make the European-made goods more expensive than those same goods made in the U.S. and would encourage Americans to buy American-made products. Southerners felt this tax was unfair and would not benefit them. Another important issue separating the North and South was slavery, its expansion into the newly created states and territories. The issue of slavery was not a problem peculiar to the Civil War era. It was a contested issue even as our country's founders were drawing up the Constitution for our new nation in 1787. Legislators argued over whether slaves should be counted as part of the state's population in determining how many representatives a state should have in Congress. The lawmakers finally decided that a slave would represent 3/5 of a person. This is called the 3/5 Compromise. For the next 40 years, different lifestyles also separated the North from the South. By the 1820s, the northern states still had many farms, yet these states were also building large cities. These cities were important centers for commercial trade. The majority of factories, banks, and people in the United States were now living in the northern cities. Northern employers depended on cheap immigrant labor from Europe to work in the new factories. The development of modern modes of transportation, like the railroad, were critical to the expansion of northern businesses. These wealthy northerners looked to the new states to expand their factories and way of life. They wanted their workers to freely choose their employers. This kind of labor is called free labor. In the South, it was quite a different story. In the South, there were very few cities with factories. The Southern way of life had grown to become centered around small farms and plantations. A plantation is a large farm that uses slaves to care for its crops. When a worker is owned by his employer, it is called slave labor. Even though most of the Southern farmers were too poor to own slaves, slavery was a necessity on the large plantation. Many of the white Southerners chose to identify with the elegant and rich lifestyle of the plantation owners and accepted this as their way of life. Cotton and tobacco represented nearly all of the South's wealth. The rich Southern planters also looked to the new states in the West to expand their plantation empires and way of life. Many Southerners understood the necessity to pressure Congress to admit the new states as slave states.
Why worry about those other states and those silly territories you keep talking about? Slave states, free states. None of it affects the low me. Who cares?
I care. The United States government cares. And you too, Serena, should bring yourself to care. More and more states and territories are accepting the ideas of free labor. When the representatives of the free states go to Congress, those northern gentlemen, they keep making laws harder and harder for our families to keep our slaves.
I cannot believe they do not accept this divine institution of slavery. As the Negro takes care of us, we must also take care of them. Life is perfect.
Not for much longer. Our good government is willing to allow for the fanatical wishes of 10 million Northerners. to rule absolutely over a much smaller southern population, slavery by law could be destroyed.
It's all beginning to come clear to me now how wrongful it is that our fate be determined by others and not ourselves.
It was the development of free labor in the North and slave labor in the South that continually drove a wedge through the United States. In 1820, war over the labor issue was averted by the Missouri Compromise. Under its terms, Missouri was allowed to enter the Union as a slave state, and Maine was admitted as a free state. The Missouri Compromise only solved the problem temporarily, for again in 1850, emotions over the slavery issue reached a fever pitch. Once again, another settlement, called the Compromise of 1850, averted civil war. The Compromise of 1850 admitted California as a free state. Utah and New Mexico territories were allowed to vote on whether slavery should be allowed in their areas. This resulted in the majority of the Senate voting power to now be in the hands of the free states. To correct some of this imbalance, the Fugitive Slave Law was also passed. It stated that law officials were responsible to catch runaway slaves and return them to their owners. Many Northerners refused to obey this law, and in fact, some helped many slaves escape through the secret network called the Underground Railroad.
Heavens, you should have been here days ago!
Boy, we've been running and hiding for days trying to keep them slave catchers off our trails. They're lifting up our fruits and green corn.
Are you all right?
Mama, I hear the horses.
It's them slave catchers, they's real close.
There's no time to lose. Lie down here.
Afternoon, Miss Rebecca.
Afternoon, Sheriff. What brings you out here?
Well, this here is Mr. Jedediah Hunt. Now, word has it there's some fugitive slaves running in this area.
Ma'am, I followed them all the way from Georgia, and I ain't leaving Pennsylvania without them.
You see, Miss Rebecca, word has it you're an abolitionist. Rumor is that you've been going to them society meetings, passing out petitions, trying to end slavery. Now, we have a warrant, and I'm afraid Mr. Hunt is going to have to inspect your cabin.
Sheriff, you know that I feel slavery is inhuman. But still, I would never break the law.
Miss, I ain't looking to argue with you. Now, the law states I have to find them, take them back. You just mind your business. You might end up in prison. I even thinks you're trying to hide or help them fugitives.
Know a man from Georgia one time had a book just like this. Caught him trying to hide one of my slaves under the floorboards.
Sorry to have bothered you, Miss Rebecca. Seems there's no fugitives here after all.
Melinda Jackson, right?
Yes, ma'am, and this here's Cece.
Where did you come from?
Georgia, ma'am. I was owned by a cotton farmer named Thomas Dillon. He wasn't a very hard man, but he was down on black folks having their liberty. I've been in bondage about 35 years.
You'll be in Canada soon and free.
Free. That's all I was dreaming of. And I want my other children back that they sold to some gentleman they say from Mississippi. I want my husband back. Somewhere I don't even know.
We're going to help you and your girl. Right now you rest while I prepare food for your journey.
During the years 1850 to 1860, as many as 20,000 blacks escaped from slavery through the Underground Railroad. Emotions on both sides of the slavery issue once again rose in 1854 when a bill called the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed Congress. This bill repealed the Missouri Compromise and allowed residents of Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves whether or not slavery would be allowed in their states. The result of this unfortunate law was that settlers who strongly favored slavery and settlers who hated slavery both immigrated to Kansas. When these groups came into contact with each other, much fighting and killing resulted. Kansas was often referred to as Bleeding Kansas.
I must help the Georgia senator in Washington make sure our interests are represented. The laws must allow for slavery to exist in any state who so cares to choose slavery.
Isn't that what Father calls popular sovereignty? Each state having the right to choose whether to labor there be free or slave?
Yes, my dear. And the Supreme Court has stood behind that decision by stating that no matter where a slave goes
Off my needle.
or lives, he will always remain a slave.
It's about that Missouri slave.
Dred
Scott, that's right, I knew it. Dred Scott tried to get his freedom in court, thinking that if his master took him to a free state, he would also be free. I can't imagine those darkies getting their freedom.
Nor can I. Yet, we must always be on guard. Men like that John Brown scare me. Trying to raid Harper's Ferry. Such insanity. He tries to help the slaves revolt and free themselves. They hanged him, of course. But I warn you, that's not the end of it. Those abolitionists, they all want to change things. Change. We must not let the government give in to this change.
Cousin, may we please continue this conversation later?
You wish.
Although most abolitionists never resorted to violence to help slaves gain their freedom, there were exceptions. In 1859, a fanatical abolitionist named John Brown attempted to lead a slave revolt from Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Brown, along with his sons and 16 followers, tried to seize the federal government arsenal of guns. No slaves came to John Brown's aid. Brown surrendered and later was found guilty and hung. At his trial, John Brown stated,
"The crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood."
Northerners saw Brown as a martyr who sacrificed his life to the cause. Southerners were terrified this was part of a Northern plot to encourage all slaves to revolt. Some states had larger populations of black slaves than whites, and this added greatly to their fears.